Ladies and gentlemen, it's time to start. Please switch off your cell phones. All right, wonderful. Let me first introduce myself. My name is Josef Šíma. I'm president of CEVRO Institut, School of Legal and Social Studies. And we are here to celebrate a wonderful book by our dear guest, Professor Peter Boettke. But before he gets to the floor and delivers his talk, let me make a little short introduction. CEVRO Institut Academic Forum is a public lecture series where leading scholars, typically, but not exclusively, from abroad, present their views on social issues. We typically invite people with broad interdisciplinary interests so that we can strengthen the idea that for full understanding of complex social reality, we need to cross boundaries of traditional disciplines. And that is exactly what CEVRO Institute, as a true school of legal and social studies, is seeking to achieve. We were happy to host in this academic forum series such great minds as Professor Richard Epstein from University of Chicago and New York University, the most widely cited legal scholar in the world, and indeed we're very happy to publish his book, Law, Economics, and Politics, as the first book of our new book series called CEVRO Institut Academic Press. We had here over American philosopher Professor Roderick Long from Auburn University, covering a very interesting and provocative topic: why should classical liberals prefer anarchy over state power? We were pleased to debate with Professors Frank Makovec and Timothy Terrell from Wofford College about economics and the medical reform. I hope that the CEVRO Institute Academic Forum got firmly established as a project worthwhile to pay attention to, and I'm sure that after today's lecture, even those who still hesitated will be persuaded. That is because we have a very special speaker today to give a talk to our distinguished audience, you, Professor Peter Boettke from George Mason University, and his lecture will serve also as a kind of appetizer to a much bigger bite, and that's his book that is being launched hereby, Robust Political Economy for the 21st Century. George Mason University and Professors Boettke work in particular seems to be a perfect match with what CEVRO Institute as an educational institution wants to advance and cultivate. Serious and deep study of several social sciences, economics, political science, sociology, and law, connected to the study of historical context, and all that with explicit awareness of the great battle between classical liberal ideas on one hand and socialist ideas on the other. That means that you have to study political philosophy in order to understand the questions social scientists ask and also solutions they come up with. George Mason University is a very unique school, in many respects a dissident school, where cross-disciplinary approaches not compatible with what current mainstream does or did are worked on. Many of those approaches over time proved to be extremely useful, and the effort and results were ultimately applauded by the economic and not only economic profession. Hence, economics can, through the public choice theory, talk to political scientists. Constitutional political economy reaches constitutional legal theorists. Game theory became an essential toolkit for military strategists. Law and economics helps lawyers. Experimental economics explains things which before only psychologists could talk about, etc., etc. It is of great interest that in most of these approaches we can trace links to great tradition of so-called Austrian school, closely connected to the city of Prague in our country, especially to the work of Ludwig von Mises and F.A. Hayek. Professor Boettke, in his writings, does not only show how Austrian ideas penetrated the non-Austrian approaches, but more importantly, he demonstrates how the influence runs the opposite direction. The Austrian tradition in which he is firmly rooted has become, thanks to him, a school of thought whose modern formulation organically incorporates contributions of leading scholars in related economic disciplines, represented by names of Nobel Prize-winning economists such as James Buchanan, Ronald Coase, Vernon Smith, Thomas Schelling, Douglas North, or Elinor Ostrom. Professor Boettke has authored numerous books on the history, collapse, and transition from socialism in the former Soviet Union, such as The Political Economy of Soviet Socialism in 1990, Why Perestroika Failed, The Economics and Politics of Socialism Transformation, published by Routledge in 1993, Calculation and Coordination, Essays on Socialism and Transitional Political Economy, published by Routledge in 2001. He is also the co-author, along with David Pritchett-Coe, of the classic Principles of Economics of Paul Haynes, The Economic Way of Thinking, whose 12th edition got published in 2009. He has edited, among other books, nine volumes of Socialism and the Market, The Socialist Calculation Debate Revisited, published in 2000. 3 volumes of the book called The Legacy of F.A. Hayek, Politics, Philosophy, and Economics, published in 1999. 2 volumes of The Market Process, published by Elgar in 1998, or the Handbook on Austrian Economics, published last year by Elgar Publishing. His most recent book, Challenging Institutional Analysis and Development, The Bloomington School, was published by Routledge in 2009. Since 1998, Professor Boettke has served as an editor of a journal called Review of Austrian Economics. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Professor Peter Boettke. Peter, the floor is yours.
Am I supposed to click it to make it go? Oh, you're going to do it. Well, in the meantime, as he switches over, I want to thank Professor Shima for that overly gracious introduction to my work, and for this amazing sort of opportunity to come here and talk to the students and my colleagues in the field of economics. I've been very sort of overwhelmingly impressed with my visit to Prague and the opportunities that were made available to me by the CEVRO Institut, and I want to thank you in particular for bringing out this book, which I hope will introduce some of my ideas to people here, and will encourage them to work in the field of political economy, to try to sort of make the 21st century a much better place than what you were given as your inheritance when you started thinking about these things. The title of Robust Political Economy is meant to convey to you precisely that idea of a political economy that can sustain itself against, say, strong winds or an earthquake or really, really bad ideas. Bad ideas can have a devastating effect on an economy and its citizens in the same way that a bad natural disaster can have. And we need to build political institutions, right, that can withstand even that. In the United States, there's a judge named Robert Boettke. For the youngins out there, if you look up on your laptop and you say, to be borked, he was up for a Supreme Court nomination, and he got nixed, and people attacked him. And he's a Chicago economist, Chicago law and economics guy. And he wrote a book called The Antitrust Paradox. And he in that book, he said that the application of the ideas about antitrust would have the effect, if they were put into place, would have the effect on the U.S. economy like a few strategically placed nuclear bombs. So he was criticizing the standard legal practice at the time about what antitrust policy would demand. What that suggests, by the way, is that that's not a robust system. Right? That's a system that couldn't survive against, say, bad ideas becoming dominant. So what we want to find is a set of rules which can, in fact, sustain itself even in the most difficult of times. So David Hume, which a lot of these ideas come from, is the Scottish Enlightenment. David Hume argued in an essay called On Parliament in 1742 that in designing a government, we must presume that all men are knaves, and then build the government such that even if men were knaves, they couldn't act knavishly, because the institutions would tie their hands such. Right? That's this idea of trying to get at a robust political economy. Adam Smith expanded upon this. As Adam Smith argued, a politician who attempts to control the economy would not only be operating without knowledge of the local situation, it's an actual phrase that Smith used in 1776, anticipates this passage, which is the passage right before the invisible hand passage, anticipates almost everything that Hayek worked on as a scientist. Smith got there in the Scottish Enlightenment in 1776. So the politician who attempts to control the economy would not only be operating without the knowledge of the local situation that businessmen have and entrepreneurs possess, but would be, by necessity, would load himself with a task and a level of power which could not be safely trusted to no individual lawgiver or council or senate whatsoever, and would nowhere be as dangerous as in the hands, and this is a direct quote from him, of those who had folly and presumption enough to fancy himself fit to exercise it. So Hume is concerned to a large degree with our knavishness being our ability to cheat our fellow man. Smith is worried about that, but he's also worried about our arrogance, the arrogance of the knave, who thinks he can actually rule your life. So there's two types of knaves. Keep that in mind. The knave who doesn't think he can rule your life, but wants to steal from you at will. The other knave who actually thinks he can run your life better than you could, all right, and he would like to be, in charge of that. In the theory of moral sentiments, Smith refers to this, is that the man of systems is comfortable in, his conceit. All right? That's, Hayek later on refers to this as the fatal conceit. All right? Ludwig von Mises, he explains how it is that we lost this wisdom that Hume and Smith had given us. And what Mises does in a passage about the evolution of liberal ideas is he explains that once the inference was made that the state was not only morally benevolent, but that the state was also intellectually perfect, that the conclusion that the state should be in control of the economy became inevitable, became an inevitable conclusion of the analysis. So it's that move towards omniscience. So keep in mind there's two things here. Go back again to the Adam Smith and David Hume and the nature of the knavery. If you're dealing with, in this case, Mises says, the omniscience assumption, all right, then we're going to be in deep trouble. So we have omniscience and benevolence. We can't get away with that. I know that this is, my wife complains to me about PowerPoints all the time. She would like it if I never gave a PowerPoint. I have to blame this on me being intellectually lazy and not knowing how to give a speech without my crutch. But also, universities in America have forced us all to give PowerPoints. We were supposed to do it because that's how to be in a smart classroom. So they've loaded all our classrooms with computers and these projectors, and so we better make use of them. And the other thing is they eliminated chalkboards. So what else are you going to do, right? So, but my wife says to me, Pete, they're PowerPoints, not power paragraphs. And I've also read all the stories that whenever you have to change the font, you shouldn't do it. But my excuse is, I'm not in the business of giving public lectures. I'm in the business of being an academic. And we academics, we can dress a little weird. We can, do all kinds of things that the normal person couldn't do, including putting full paragraphs on a PowerPoint and reducing it to a size 12, because my view is, when they blow it up really big, you'll be able to read it in the back of the room. You can't, I understand. So I apologize for this, but maybe you should get the slides and whatever, and you'll read it you'll read this argument inside the book. So just listen to me a little bit here. So what Hayek argues in his essay, Individualism, True and False, is that there should be no doubt that the chief contribution of the Scottish Enlightenment, Smith and Hume, right, that's Smith's chief concern, was not so much with what men might occasionally achieve when he is at his best, but that he should have as little opportunity as possible to do harm when he is at his worst. The great discovery of the Scottish Enlightenment thinkers was that the private property market economy does precisely that with respect to the economy. By using the institution of private property and the freedom of exchange, what it does is it motivates man in his ordinary life, not presuming that he's a saint. Doesn't require for its operation that he's a saint. It doesn't require for his operation that he's intelligent. It takes man as he is, and then through the incentives and information of the private property market economy, steers him towards generating publicly desirable outcomes. That was their great institutional discovery. All right? It's man and his ordinary motives. As it says here, they sought for a social system which does not depend for its functioning on our finding good men for running it. All right? But to give freedom to all rather than just to an elite. It's the opposite of the French Enlightenment. Right? That's a key issue here. There's a French Enlightenment and then there's a Scottish Enlightenment. In the French Enlightenment, the idea was to define rules in which the best and the brightest in society could do good in the world. And the Scottish Enlightenment is the humbler project. How do we find rules that bad men can do least harm. That's what it's meant to be robust. The French system's not robust. Scottish Enlightenment's for the robustness. So when I think about my research program, which is very aptly summarized in this book, and the selection of essays that is in here, and in particular, the way Professor Sima introduces it, he starts with a quote from F.A. Hayek, which says that, an economist that is only an economist can do great damage to society. That's this idea that I've been trying to get at. You introduced that wonderfully into this thing and to describe the selection here. What I call this research program, when it's not necessarily robustness, is this issue of comparative political economy. That's what I do. My background was in that. All of my motivations and whatnot come out of the debates that are associated with that field. And what I wanted to do in doing all of this was to, if you think about the history of the Austrian school, what the Austrian school was doing, that's the Mises, Hayek, and Kerzner research program in economics. And what they did was they challenged the assumption of omniscience. When Hayek gave his Nobel Prize address, its title is The Pretense of Knowledge. All of Hayek's arguments are about the failure of the assumption of omniscience. And as I pointed out with the quote from Mises was right on that as well. All right, that we have to challenge the assumption of omniscience. But what the Austrians did, because of value freedom issues that they wanted to insist on in their analysis, is they kept the assumption of benevolence intact. Right? Because if they could show that even a benevolent despot, but that lacked omniscience, couldn't achieve its goal, how much stronger was their argument? Okay? So that's how they approached it intellectually in their debate. They didn't want to debate the motivations of rulers. So they just assumed, the rulers are benevolent. They want what's good for society. But what I'm going to show is that they don't know. Even if they want to do it, they don't know how to do it. They need the market to be able to get that information. The development of the theory of public choice did the exact opposite. It assumed that rulers were omniscient. But what they challenged was the assumption of benevolence. Right? So if you think about the problem of doing the right thing, right? I'm going to do the right thing. It has two questions. The first one is, why? Why should I do the right thing? I don't want to do the right thing. Right? So you have to be motivated to want to do the right thing. All right? How many here have read Wittgenstein? Students out there. The philosopher, Wittgenstein. No? You should read him. You can't read him because no one can understand him. But it's my favorite joke about Wittgenstein is Keynes was in the room in Cambridge, and Wittgenstein has this idea about a private language argument. He was pacing back and forth in the room saying to the students, I'm stupid today. I have nothing to say today. I am stupid. And then he says, but I will tell you this. If a lion appeared before you and could speak, you couldn't understand it. And Keynes supposedly turned to G.E. Moore and said, I don't know about you, but if I can understand Wittgenstein, I sure as hell could understand a lion. So Keynes was witty, a very witty guy. But, Wittgenstein, the story about Wittgenstein is very simple. When he was 8 years old, he grew up in the wealthiest family, or one of the wealthiest families in all of Europe. He was 8 years old, he was running in the house, and he knocked over a vase. And his mother came out. It was one of those Ming vases, really expensive or whatnot. And his mother comes out and says, Ludwig, did you do that? And he said he didn't know what to say. Should I tell her the truth? I get a spanking. Or I blame it on the cat, I get away with it. And he says at that moment he decided he wanted to be a philosopher. All right? 8 years old. That's why his life went crazy. But anyway, you weren't thinking about that when you were 8. But note what's going on here. He has to ask the question to himself, why is it, why should I do the right thing, which is to tell my mom the truth? Right? If he was benevolent, of course, he would tell her, right? So he asks a question. So the first question you have to ask yourself is, doing the right thing, why? But then say you're even motivated to do the right thing, then you have to ask yourself, what is the right thing to do? How do I know? Right? In your lives, right? You know, you're dating a girl. Do you want to keep dating her or break up with her? Right? You want to do the right thing. How do you know what the right thing is? She might be the dream of your life. Maybe right around the corner, another dream of your life is waiting for you. Right? So you commit to this one, you miss the sin over here, right? You know, like, oh, no, I missed that. Right? And it's a great tragedy for you, right? So how is it, you have to know what is the right thing to do, right? And how am I going to, you know, do I want to do it? And how am I going to do it? You think about the Austrians, they're all focused on, okay, how do I know what the right thing is? The public choice people were, why should the state ever do the right thing? All right, in a few days from now, many of you will be here for this conference. There's going to be, a man named Terry Anderson here, a very brilliant scholar from Montana and Stanford as well. He lives in both places. And he works on the field of what's called resource economics, or, you know, sort of property rights economics resource. One of his good friends is a man named Fred McChesney, and Fred McChesney wrote a wonderful essay on how Indian lands were divided up in the American West. And standard economics assumed, he's a public choice guy, Fred McChesney, and standard economics had assumed that they would just divide up the property rights the way that a socially benevolent planner would do. And Fred McChesney went historically and asked the question, why would they do that? What incentives does the U.S. government have to divide up the lands in the Indian nation the right way? Well, it turns out they didn't. They actually did it really inefficiently for the Indians, but really beneficial to them. Right? That's what public choice sort of focuses on. The incentives that politicians face in making decisions so that they can benefit themselves at the expense of others. Okay, so now what do we have here? We have a challenge to the assumption of omniscience, and we have a challenge to the assumptions of benevolence. Why should the Austrians and the public choice people keep, what about that both problems exist in the world? Not only do you not know what it is that you're doing, all right, but you don't have any incentive to do what God would do if you were in that position. You have an incentive to do what you would do, which would be to serve your private interest, not the public interest. What's the public interest? We don't even know what it is. No one can tell it to me. As Adam Smith says in his Invisible Hand passage, he says, no good was ever done by those who intend the public interest. I agree with him. So the whole debate, splitting of these arguments was a function of 20th century economic debates and how you were going to take a side on it. For the 21st century, it's time for us to challenge both. We have to guard against knavery of both the hubristic type, the pretense of knowledge, and the opportunistic type. And this leads to what I consider to be a hybrid version of Austrian economics and public choice economics, which could be called Virginia political economy. All right, now why did I stumble upon this? Well, when I was studying comparative economic systems, the main intellectual leader of economics at that time, probably the leading theorist. Now, you got to go back. This is a while ago, 20 years ago. All right, so this guy's no longer as big. He's a Nobel Prize winner. His name is Joe Stiglitz. And he was an it factor. Right? He has, in his book, Whither Socialism, which is his Vixell lectures, it's about a 200-page book. He has 161 references to his own papers, separate papers, all right? He wrote a lot, and he wrote on every topic. And what he did was he challenged two assumptions in neoclassical core theory, all right? So in most economic models, they assume full and complete information. And what Stiglitz did was he said, okay, so they have full and complete information, and perfect markets, perfectly competitive markets. And so what Stiglitz did was, using the same intellectual apparatus as all mainstream economists, he just tweaked two assumptions. The first assumption is he challenged perfect information with imperfect information, in particular the notion of asymmetric information. One side of the market knows, the other side of the market doesn't know. And his second one is he challenged the notion of perfect competition, and he introduced imperfect market structures. Then, with those two assumptions, what he did was go through the same exercise as all other mainstream economists, and he reversed the welfare properties and flipped them on their head. All right? So he overturned all of mainstream economics to now a new mainstream, right, which was Stiglitz. Okay, now, in the United States, we often make this distinction between saltwater economists and freshwater economists. So if you think about where the universities lie, those that lie on the Atlantic Ocean, that's the Ivy Leagues, and then those who lie on the Pacific Ocean, right, that would be Stanford and Berkeley, okay? They're like, what do you normally think about when you think about economics that comes to them? They're very interventionist. That's where Stiglitz's economics dominates. Now, how about the freshwater economists? Those are economists that are inland, right? And that would be like the University of Chicago, right? They're the ones who are more market advocates. So Stiglitz, by the way, was on the coast. He became the dominant thinker when I was in graduate school. So I thought to myself, Stiglitz got away with tweaking two assumptions and putting them together, and that's pretty cool. Why can't I do that? If I take a little bit of Hayek and I mix them a little bit with Buchanan and I smush them together, I can do something that those guys didn't do. That's what you got in this book, right? That's, and I worked through the same thing. That's the easiest way to think about it. So here's my intellectual motivation. That's my hatred can be amused, and I wanted to respond to him. I wanted to somehow, punch him intellectually so that I would stand over him like Muhammad Ali over Sonny Liston. You guys would have to look that up probably, but there's a great thing. He knocks him down, he stands over him, it's great. Anyway, and I wanted to take him on and do that because he was writing books like Wither Socialism. He was saying that bumbling bureaucrats will always outperform erring entrepreneurs. These are papers that were coming out while I was being educated. Okay? So my hybrid theoretical, that's a picture from the Wall Street Journal article. And not that I think I'm good looking. I actually don't. I hate looking at myself. I used to be when I was your age. I was actually very fit and good looking. Something bad happened. Anyway, I'm not going to blame it on my wife. She's a sweetheart. But she's an unbelievably good Italian cook. But the triangle that I have here is the public choice, the entrepreneurial theory of the market process, institutional analysis, which is the Bloomington stuff, and it's that hybrid of that economics, which is Virginia political economy. All right? And that's the school of thought that I represent, so the modern development of Austrian economics in that strain. I actually think, after talking to people here, I'd be very excited to have, not just the Virginia School of Political Economy, but I actually think, you're already, around you guys, you're developing sort of a Prague School of Political Economy and meeting with the students. I think it's fascinating, and so I want to encourage you, to do all of that. And it's also the case that you would be like freshwater types, so that's good, we don't have to change even those distinctions, but, so it's good. All right. This is the bottom line. For the students that were in the lecture last night, this is how I end it, my talk. So it's a good, foreshadowing of what's going on here. But the substantive claim that's being made is that the liberal order is robust against the knavery of man as measured as deviations away from omniscience and benevolence. And that socialism is extremely fragile against those deviations. So you have the good society on the one axis, look how quickly you move away from the ideal good society under socialism when you don't have, Albert Einstein and Mother Teresa running things or something, okay? In fact, Albert Einstein and Mother Teresa, they're not even good enough. It would, God running things, okay? And so look how quickly that you would, collapse. Whereas liberalism can put up with a lot of, as Hayek says in that quote that I give you in the thing, man, sometimes intelligent, more often stupid, sometimes good, often bad, right? You can deal with people that are stupid and bad and yet nevertheless still have the system working because the institutions are the embodiment of the intelligence, not the rulers, right? The system. In fact, there's a great paper by this guy Goder and Saunders from Yale. That's a simulation. I don't know how many here know this paper, but it's on low intelligence traders, in which they work with computer simulations, but they put low intelligence traders into a double auction, and they still nevertheless, the market clears. All right? So in like 2 or 3 rounds. It's a groping market model, and they get there. But so it doesn't require the perfect knowledge assumption for markets to work. All right? That's a key point, because the market itself mobilizes the information, not the actors within the economy. All right, so if you think about this idea in liberalism, and I'll try to finish up very quickly here, Joe. So, if you think about this model of liberalism, how robust it is against the changes, the question is, well, why is that such a good thing? Why is that a good thing? And the argument here is that the reason why it's a good thing is because liberalism, by being robust against the deviations, allows us, human beings, to realize the gains from social cooperation under division of labor. All right? As we can deal with anonymous others in our actions, we can benefit from the vast division of labor that's worldwide and the knowledge that's embedded and mobilized from all over the world. I said to the students the other day, no one of you could produce a pencil, but the liberal order enables you to all benefit from having pencils. That's because the market is able to tap into all of this knowledge all over the place. None of those people know who it is that you are, and they all just produce their little part that goes into that pencil because they earn a living doing it. Not because they love you, they don't even know who you are. All right? But they produce their small part, but essential part to that piece because they all make a living on it and it all is coordinated. The production plans of some mesh with the consumption demands of others. Okay, so we realize these anonymous actors of great social distance, great ethnic heterogeneity. Voltaire observed in the late Middle Ages, right, in the time at which we were having the persecution of religious heretics, okay, and Voltaire observed that the Jew, the Gentile, and the Muslim may war with one another, but they reconcile their differences when they come to meet into the market. This became a thesis that was known in liberal traditions as the du commerce thesis. We don't hear much about it in your classes anymore, because now you hear about the ruthless efficiency of markets. But what markets do is they're actually civilizing agents. They allow the stranger to no longer be a stranger. Kant had a hope for humanity. And that hope was that there would be that you would be strangers nowhere in this world. That's true cosmopolitanism. Strangers, that's his phrase, strangers nowhere in the world. And economists talk about the ability to realize the gains because of the company of strangers. That is, people of social distance. These two things are not at odds with one another, but instead made available to us So think about it this way. For the students here, it's the further someone is away from you, the more you can gain from learning from what they have to offer. Right? But the more difficult it is to understand them. Right? So the less familiar the other is to you, the more you could potentially learn. Okay? But the problem is, how do you learn from them? If it truly was the case that they were alien from you, they would always remain alien, and therefore you couldn't learn from them. That's like, Wittgenstein and his lion or whatever. They would be in their language community, you'd be in yours, you couldn't even talk. So somehow something has to translate across the distance so that you're able to realize the benefits. Now, as an economist, what are you thinking about? They produce exotic products that I couldn't even think about. But somehow they have to come to me through trade. And then I give them something in return. Right? That's how we grow this massive economy. Right? Adam Smith had a great phrase, the division of labor is limited by the extent of the market. But he had no end to that phrase. What do I mean by that? Division of labor is the greatest cause for the increase in productivity of mankind. But the division of labor is limited by the extent of the market. You grow the market, what do? You get finer and finer divisions of labor. Therefore, greater productivity. Grow the market, get greater. There's no end to this circle. This is the virtuous circle of trade. Western civilization is grounded on this virtuous circle of trade expanding. Poverty is a consequence of restricting that circle of trade. So how do you realize that? You have to have something that makes us be able to enjoy the company of strangers and eventually for individuals to be strangers nowhere in this world. Nowhere in the world. That's the Kantian hope. That's the liberal project. So what's my hope for the 20th century, 21st century? 20th century was bad news. A lot of people died. Horrible. Right? There's a book by a guy named R.J. Rummel, Death by Government. Highly recommend it to all of you. All right? The death toll of the 20th century due not to famine or anything like that, but man-made disasters. Right? Not because, some accident happened, asteroid hit us or whatever, right? But because people with bad ideas did bad things, and they want to, the governments decided to make those choices, okay? So what do we hope for the 21st century? It hasn't started out so well, has it? All right? It's not starting out so well, so we have to hope that we can somehow fix these things. And so the first thing that I want to say is we have to fix our public predation. What I mean by that is the predating aspects of the government on its citizens. And one of the reasons why I have hope about this is precisely because we have so many states that are going through fiscal crisis that their legitimacy is called into question. By the way, again, Adam Smith was all about this. He knew about this. In the 5th book of The Wealth of Nations, which is actually his advice to the statesman, in the 5th book of The Wealth of Nations, he gives the statesman all kinds of advice, but one of the things he warns about is what he calls the juggling trick that all governments engage in. And that juggling trick was that governments will engage in deficit finance, which becomes accumulated public debt, and then they'll try to pay it back by debasing their currency. So you get a cycle of deficits, debt, and debasement. And that's how countries get destroyed. So you have to somehow curtail that. He also says the reason why we engage in public debt is because politicians find war entertaining. That's their entertainment for the princes to send their little people out there to fight. And then they, have to pay for it. So then they do that. Then they mess the rest of you up by debasing the currency. So it's an endless cycle. So somehow what Smith is saying, we got to have some solution. So you guys probably never saw this movie. There's a TV series in the United States called Buffy the Vampire Slayer. I've seen every episode. But there's also a movie called Buffy the Vampire Slayer. It's a really bad movie, but it's so bad that you like to watch it. That's why they made a TV series out of it. But there's a great scene in there where one of the vampires says to, she cuts off his arm, the vampire, in her fight. She cuts off his arm. But he's still going to try to kill her. And he says to her at one point, he says, I can do anything. And she says, yeah? Clap. Right? He can't. Right? That's like what Smith's institutional solution would be for the juggling trick. Right? It's not, what would Smith say? He says, look, you got to take away either the objects of juggling or the hands that juggle. Now imagine if that advice was followed and then Ben Bernanke, right? I don't know the name of your head of your central bank, but it's the same thing, right? If Ben Bernanke was unable to juggle, he couldn't have engaged in the analysis that he did of debts. Look at our accumulated public debt in the United States. Look at our deficits that we're running, and then look at what they're doing with the money supply in the United States. We're engaged in the deficit, debt, and debasement game. What's the end game to that? Look that up. What's the end game to the Fed policy? What you'll find is, we don't know. Adam Smith knew. You destroy the value of your currency. So we're going to be confronted with a massive problem of the scale and scope of our government because we have a fiscal system which is unsustainable. So it's now time to reopen this conversation. Reopen the conversation about what a true liberal system would be like and what is the role of the government in that system. Right? Think about what's going on in Wisconsin in the United States right now with the public employee unions. Right? And all the debate that's coming out about that. All of those questions are now going to be on the table because I'm telling you, California, Illinois, Michigan, New Jersey, they're no different than Portugal, Italy, Greece, Spain. They're no different. It's the same issue. And in fact, California is bigger than all of them. It's probably all of them all walled up in one. All right? And they had an Austrian governor, but not an Austrian economist. They didn't fix the problem. Okay. So the first thing is we have to really seriously think about all these things. So scale and scope are going to be up in the issues again. The second one is we have to do something about these conflicts. And it's my hope that the more we free open the economy, there's an old rule, right? Which is, it used to be the case that they always used to say, no two countries with McDonald's in them ever went to war. Right? So a country that didn't have McDonald's, that's not true anymore, But that used to be an old phrase. But there's Bastiat had a great phrase, which he said, if goods and services don't cross borders, soldiers certainly will. All right? Goods and services don't cross borders, soldiers certainly will. So the do commerce thesis applies not only to a domestic economy, but to the international economy as a whole. And as we grow our international trade and our exchange relationships with other countries, we should be engaged in trade rather than war with other countries. Okay? And we're going to have to find some answer to this. We're going to have to take the challenge that Kant put to us about becoming true cosmopolitan citizens of the world in which none of us are strangers nowhere in the world. Peter Berger, the great sociologist, put this challenge to us as follows back in the 1970s. He said, imagine that you move into a new neighborhood. You walk out in that neighborhood and the first person you see is wearing a full, burqa. How do you react? Right? Or how about if they're gypsies and they give you the evil eye, the stink eye, right? How are you going to react? All right? It's finding exchange even in our differences that Kant is asking us to do. Kant didn't ask us to become homogeneous people. This claim about the cosmopolitanism is about an attitude. It's an attitude of a live and let live and the benefit through voluntary interactions with one another. And it's my hope that in the 21st century we get that. So if we take care of public predation and we take care of peace, okay, what I truly believe is that the prosperity that we will achieve will be unimaginable to our parents. And our kids will live a life that's unimaginable to us. Because the greatest resource is the human imagination. And as long as individuals don't thwart the creative spirit of mankind, amazing opportunities for trade and technological innovation exist. We will realize these great gains from trade. Think about it this way. 1 billion Chinamen and 1 billion Indians are being integrated into the world economy that for 50 years they were unable to do. What is the consequence of that? Think about Adam Smith's division of labor is limited by the extent of the market. We've now grown the market. Think about integrating Africa into the world economy. All right? There's people in Africa living on less than $2 a day. Their lives will be immensely improved by integration into the world economy. How can we realize that through the global marketplace? And I'll end with one last thing, which is that I tell my students this all the time, is that if, and I should have drawn this, but I didn't, but if you imagine a total factor production for those of you who are studying economics, so some kind of combinations of capital and labor and a total factor productivity curve, all right? And then what happens when we see increases in that factor productivity, right? We see actually that whole curve shift up. And then on each of the curve, in time t1, let's say, we do some stupid stuff. So we get a deviation against the trend. So that means that we're going to have a boom and a bust. And then somehow we get a new productivity curve because there's been some gains from trade and gains from technological innovation. And then you get stupidity again at time t2, and you'll get a boom and a bust. So here's the point, right? Because I'm trying to get you to imagine a graph that I haven't drawn. All right. But remember, the ultimate resource is the human imagination. All right. So if you think about what I did with technology and trade to move that curve up, tomorrow's trough here, not the boom, right? The trough is still going to be higher than today's peak. So we'll be better off. We'll be better off. We'll realize prosperity that we otherwise wouldn't have realized. But if you don't get the bump up of that curve, tomorrow's trough can be, in fact, if you go down, tomorrow's peak can be lower, right, than today's trough. And that has happened in human history. It happened right here. So I tell my students there's a horse race going on. 3 S's. First horse, Smith. And that horse, galloping along, represents the gains from trade. And then the second horse, right, that's Schumpeter. And that horse is galloping along, and that's the gains from innovation. And then there's a third horse. We would like it to be an old nag, but sometimes it's not. And that's called stupidity, and that's government. And as long as the third horse's nose doesn't outpace Smith and Schumpeter, we'll muddle through. Not as good as we'd like, but we'd still be better off tomorrow than we are today. But if that horse gets ahead, right, that old nag starts to get some legs to it, all right, then we're going to be in big trouble. And the economist has to be the person that rides the old nag. All right? We have to be the one that pulls it back. All right? We can't steer the first thing about the gains from trade, and we can't steer even the second one about the gains for innovation. We might want to as governments and think we could pick winners and losers, but we can't. But what we can do is put constraints on that third horse and bring it and reel it back in. And that is my hope of the reeling back in, is protecting that horse from the exploitation by omniscient knaves, all right, and benevolent knaves, right? You want to make sure that you're going to have protections against omniscience, hubristic, and protection against opportunistic claims of benevolence. And that's how you build robust political economy. Anyway, thank you. Thank you. Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you, Pete, for your wonderful talk. Now we have half an hour, perhaps a little bit more, to debate, to discuss, to have comments, or to ask questions. So if there is anybody with a question, we would need mics. Do we have mics, microphones? All right, they are there. So please raise your hand or stand up and have your comments or questions. I'm sure there will be people asking. There is one here.
How did you know I was going to have a question? Anyway, I'm all in favor of constraining the horse, the government horse, but I'd be interested in hearing some suggestions about how you make that government listen to the economist. That is, that would be something I'd find truly revolutionary. Not that I would like to play down your talk, but this is something I would be most interested in. Thank you.
Should I answer it right away? Should I just sit here and answer? Yeah. That's a great question, Dan. Obviously, Adam Smith, argued in his lifetime that he didn't expect free trade to ever be, sort of passed, right? And not only that, but when Adam Smith was actually in the customs house, he actually was a pretty good regulator. How do you do this? Just one other quote that supports your position. Hayek says that the problem with the economist is that he's the one social scientist who's called upon to pro-offer his advice to governments more than any other social scientist, only to have his advice dismissed as soon as it's uttered. Okay? So my favorite, this is right up your alley. My favorite, economist on this is W.H. Hutt. He wrote an essay called Politically Impossible, and his argument was economists should not be in the business of trying to water down their policy prescriptions in order to be politically feasible, because by the time that politicians get a hold of them, they'll water them down even more, and then the next thing you know, you won't even recognize what it is you're doing. The reason why I think we have an opportunity is because the states are confronted with a great challenge. And there is always what we call a constitutional moment. So let's think about like the situation in Czechoslovakia in 1989. The best window of opportunity for an economist probably would have been between 1989 and 1990. By 1991, it was probably already too normalized for the economist to have his ideas. So you have to be there at the time that the crisis hits, because it's precisely at that time that all of the rents are up for grabs, because you've had a crisis of the fiscal state. So forget all the other reasons why socialism had problems. Just recognize that it met a fiscal crisis, meaning it couldn't sustain itself. This is true in Russia. This is across the board, all these systems. So what you have here is that's what we have right now, right? This fiscal crisis. And so as a result, you have to rethink what the hell you're doing. And the previous people who were in charge of the money and the power, those rents are up for grabs. Okay? So it's in reconstituting at that particular moment. This is why I like Buchanan. The problem with Hayek, right, is that Hayek would have counseled, it seems, by reading him, that, in Western civilization it took 500 years and, it evolved, right? Buchanan tries to give us some argumentative structures by how we can deal with the protective state, the productive state, and the redistributive state. And then he asked the puzzle to himself, right? How do I empower the protective and the productive without empowering the redistributive? All right? Previous efforts at doing that haven't proved to be that robust. That's why we're in this fiscal situation. Because the redistributive state becomes the churning state, which means the goal of democratic politics is to concentrate benefits on the well-organized, well-informed, disperse the costs on the unorganized, ill-informed, right? Which means that you're, the least ill-informed, not to be racy or anything, but what is the least informed and least organized interest group? Sperm cells. They have no vote, right? They're the least, so what we're always going to do is rob Peter to pay Paul, right? So you're always going to pass the debt. That's why there's a short-sightedness bias in politics. You're going to concentrate benefits on the well-organized, well-informed interest groups today and disperse the costs on the unorganized, ill-informed, mass of voters tomorrow. And that's why you get deficits and debt. Because debt's a future obligation to pay tax, right? So what's going on in California? The bills due, right? The bills due. So now you have one of two things. Pay the bill. Why? It's huge. I didn't do this, right? You did, right? And you say that in some like a funny accent or whatever, right? And so I'm not going to pay it. So now what do, right? So now they have a chance to rethink it. So when you have monetary institutions at your disposal, you try to inflate to pay them back in cheaper dollars. That's Smith's juggling trick. When you don't have monetary institutions, like for example, what's going on in the pigs countries because they have the European Union, or in the United States where the states don't have their own ability to make their currencies, right? What you do then is you start thinking, how do I then redo this contract? I might repudiate. At that point, someone has to redesign. So do you see what I'm saying? I'm saying I agree 100% with you, except in these moments when there's a constitutional moment because the state has become illegitimate and the rents are all up for grabs. Once they get settled again, however they get settled, we're back to your world, which is that we're like talking and no one's listening. All right? But right at that point, we have a chance to actually do some institutional designs, I would hope.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments?
You have painted a hopeful picture of 21st century. You haven't mentioned a danger of another crisis. Do you exclude that, or how would you comment on that, please?
Another financial crisis?
Financial and economic crisis.
Yeah, I'm hope so my teacher Jim Buchanan, his teacher was Frank Knight, and Frank Knight was a curmudgeon, and he used to say to people, to say a situation is hopeless is to say it's ideal. So we're obviously not in the ideal world, so there must still be hope. And that's kind of the position that I have. So if I gave you a hopeful message, I'm glad, because I am trying to say that there is a possibility of a hopeful message. But I'm not that confident in my hopefulness. I'm just by nature kind of a hopeful person. If I was a different type of person, I would give a much gloomier thing. But if you listen to what I'm saying about the juggling trick and the financial crisis, to me, the biggest problem in the United States is that we turned a market correction into an economy-wide crisis precisely by the steps that our government took to avert the crisis. And I'm not very hopeful at all that Ben Bernanke, who, by the way, I have a tremendous respect for as an economic scholar, and I wouldn't want his job at all. In fact, I often say to people, I was a colleague of Ben Bernanke for a few years, and I always used to say, I say to people all the time, I said, I never would wish this job on him. He's the nicest guy in the world. The job really does belong to Paul Krugman, who's not a nice guy, so he should be going bald and all the rest of that, pulling his own hair out. But Ben Bernanke's like the sweetest guy in the world. But he is a brilliant scholar, and he sees the world based on his scholarly view, and I think it's an intellectual error. He committed us to certain policies, and he has a belief. If you would have seen him on his 60 Minutes interview, he said, I can stop inflation like that. Keynes, by the way, said the same thing. I can stop inflation like that. That's not true. Hayek, from my perspective, correctly warned us and said, playing this dance with inflation is like holding a tiger by the tail. And either the tiger gets away from you or it turns around and bites you. In either way, you get eaten. And Bernanke believes that he can cut the spigot off by sucking up the excess reserves precisely at the right time to balance with the expansion or flood of cash that he's been putting into the economy and in the money supply. And I don't believe that any central banker anywhere in the world can do that dance. And so I'm very, very nervous about the future of the U.S. economy and all that goes with that with respect to the dollar and whatnot. And so, but what I'm choosing to focus on is how that crisis, this goes back to Dan's point, how that crisis creates a constitutional moment in which we might be able to re-examine the fundamental institutions that we've adopted, such as a central bank. All right? It's unimaginable 25 years ago that Ron Paul would be the person in charge of overseeing from Congress the central bank of the United States. And yet that's exactly what's going on right now in the United States. Whatever your view is on that or whatnot. So, but if we have another issue, failure, there's a very good chance that we could start the dialogue about what this institution does and whether or not it can do the tasks that it sets it out to do. And that's just one institution. There's all kinds of institutions. So I'm very, very fearful of the possibility of a very bad downturn because of the policy steps that we've taken.
Thank you. Floor is still open for questions. One here and then the next in the middle on the right hand.
Thank you, Professor. My fear is that you are overestimating the monetary policies over the regulatory or the legislative process. For example, here in the European Union, I think the European Commission thinks that it's omnipotent and omniscient and that they can legislate over every step of our lives. And there may be a downturn, as you said, but I fear that the downturn may come in 50 years and people will have to struggle for 50 years in a society that probably would resemble the Soviet Union if it still existed. Thank you.
I think that's a very good observation. I mean, Adam Smith argued that that the power of the market economy can overcome the impertinent, laws and regulations of human folly. He says hundreds of impertinent, regulations of human folly, but not 10,000s. I've used the analogy in an essay of mine called "What Happened to Efficient Markets," and I use the analogy with Michael Phelps, the great Olympic swimmer. And I say, look, if you tied Michael Phelps' hands and threw him into the water, he probably could outswim almost everyone because, he's got big feet and, they do that breaststroke thing and he could probably get across. And by the way, trainers in swimming, they do that thing with the paddle anyway, right? And then I said, well, how about if you tie his feet? Well, if you tied his feet, he won the gold medal in the butterfly, so he could kick and, he could get across the thing. He'd probably do pretty good. He beat all of us, right? He might not win the gold medal, but he beat all of us. So if you tied Michael Phelps' hands and you tied his feet, he'd still be a pretty good swimmer. He wouldn't fall, down and he would get across, just not as fast as he would without those ties. But if you tied a 300-pound weight to his belt and then threw him in the water and he sank, you can't point to that and then say, swimmer failure, but that's exactly what intellectuals do about the market. They tie the market's hands, they tie the market's feet, they put a 300-pound weight on it, and they say, look, market failure, right? And this is exactly what happened in the United States with respect to, what we currently just went through. And I have a monograph called The House That Uncle Sam Built. You can get it for free online. And one of the things that we do there is we provide, a table with the evidence of the new regulations that have been passed, right, since Clinton, as opposed to the idea that we lived through an era of deregulation. We lived through an era of massive regulation over our financial markets. Our financial markets are one of the most regulated parts of the United States industry, next only to our healthcare industry, okay? And Europe is just as bad, if not worse. I want to say something about Europe because many people who are older here will remember this, but, Margaret Thatcher, when she was asked about the European Union, said, I didn't roll back the bureaucracy on Downing Street to be subjected to the Eurocrats in Brussels. And she held to her guns on that. Okay? Václav Klaus, in the early part of the transition when European Union ascension was possible, he was in favor of it because he wanted policy harmony. Because by joining the EU, you would have had better policies than what you currently were getting out of your own government. So he wanted to do that. But by the time he joined the EU, if you remember, when he signed, he said, this is the worst thing I've ever done, right? He didn't do the Thatcher line, right? In the early part, he wasn't in a position to do that, but he was an advocate of that for policy harmony reasons. But, the European Union and the Euro, because of things like what's going on in these, the pigs countries, what we call the pigs, right, and other things, it's very likely that the Euro won't survive and the European Union is not going to, take off. And to me, I was asked a question by a Swiss magazine recently, and they said, do you think the Euro will survive? And I said, I hope not. Right? I want to get back to where you actually have more competition, in these things, and less regulations of your economies, and, more open trade. I'm all in favor of trading zones and free trade among zones, zero tariff, kind of areas. But that's not, what you got, right? And so I think that, it's a big set of questions. And the young people here, that's how you have to sort of grapple with them. They're big questions, big opportunities. And with big opportunities, big challenges come big opportunities. So, make the most out of them. Prove Dan wrong. Economists can have a big influence in those constitutional moments. We got to take advantage when the iron's, hot.
Next question, Marek.
Does it work? Okay. You started with the quotation from David Hume saying that when we design constitutions, we should assume that people are knaves. Now, there is this literature arguing that if you have constitutions for knaves, then you will attract knaves to the government, and you crowd out the social preferences and whatnot. So do you think that he should have emphasized, or he should have said that we should design constitutions for ignorant people, or how would you comment on that? Thank you.
I mean, you point to, there's a guy named Julian Legrand who wrote a book on princes, knaves, and whatever, and there's this idea of endogenous preferences. This is what you're talking about. And it's a neat idea, and there's Jeff Brennan, and has written a paper in which he says, power may corrupt, but it also may ennoble, right? And so the idea that you're going to be this ennoble power, thing or whatever, and we have to think about those kind of ideas. I think I actually personally think that literature misses what it is that Hume is trying to get at. Because what Hume is trying to get at is not that we would cater to knaves, right? But that what we will do is we will build institutions of governance such that you can't be a knave. Right? That's the challenge. So it's like you simply couldn't be it. So it's the opposite of the argument that Hayek gives on why the worst get on top. Right? The reason why you get the worst on top under one institutional setting is because you've now encouraged a particular agent type, right, that has no qualms about engaging in discretionary power. What Hume is doing is we're going to tie the ruler's hands such that you can't even be like a knave. You can't grab the fruit. What I'd like to think about this is just give you an example of this. Is in Capitalism and Freedom, Milton Friedman's first real foray into liberal political economy. What Friedman writes in that essay, he talks about monetary policy, which is his big specialty area. And he comes to the issue of the establishment of the Federal Reserve. And he says any institution that could have that big of an impact on an economy is perhaps an institution we shouldn't have. Milton Friedman says that. Okay? That's what I think Hume would force us to think about. Right? That's what and that's the answer to the question here. I have a paper that's floating around. You can get it on SSRN or write to me. It's on monetary policy and robust political economy. And it basically goes at this idea of looking at Friedman, Buchanan, and Hayek, and over the final 50, 60 years since 1950, how their views evolved about monetary policy out of their frustration. And then what would it really be like if we built a monetary institution that would be truly shielded against opportunism and hubris? And it turns out that we would have competition. I would argue we would have more of a competitive system, right? And and that would be the kind of institution rather than a monopoly supplier of the currency, which in fact makes us very vulnerable. It's not a robust institution. One last thing on this for the history of the Fed kind of thing, because, one of the things with countries that when they start things, they just adopt best practices and they look out in the world and they say, oh, the United States grew really well, so let's do that. George Selgin has a new working paper out. You can get it online about the history of the Fed and its economic performance. And it's a very, very damning economic history paper when you actually look at the evidence of what the Fed has done with regard to macroeconomic volatility. There's a belief out there that we had a period of sort of great, moderation period in which the macro variance was was not very great. Selgin explains why it is that we should think twice about that.
We have time for one last question. If there is one, there is one. The mic is coming. It is. The people at the back need to hear you.
Thank you. I would like to ask you, after all what you have said, do you prefer anarchy or democracy? Because is it really possible in democracy to perform all the changes you have shown to us?
You mean, do I think people will vote the changes that we
yeah,
get
something like that, because it's much more easier to explain the socialism in nice colors than the liberty.
I do think I'm an unusual radical in the sense that I believe that the only way to get to my sort of ideal set of institutions is by way of reforming the existing institutions in that direction rather than simply jumping to them. So if we think about the example I just gave with the Fed, I'm in favor of abolishing the Fed and in developing a competitive currency system. All right? How am I going to get there? I'm going to get there by efforts to tie the Fed's hands, to make the Fed more and more bound by rules rather than discretion. My failure at doing that will keep leading to increasing efforts to tie the ruler's hands to such an extent that eventually we move the institution off the table. And I view that that's also true about several other policy areas that I would advocate. abolishing the role of the state in education, let's say in the United States. I'm one of the people that would say vouchers is better than our current system. Tuition tax credits would be better than vouchers, right? Getting rid of the state's involvement in primary and secondary education would be better still served. So I believe we can battle along the playing field and move each of these things. One of my colleagues, Tyler Cowan, has a blog, and it's called Marginal Revolution, Small Steps to a Better World. I think this is it's a basic idea. Alfred Marshall used to say about The Economist, he says, you know, history doesn't move in giant leaps. History moves in marginal changes. And so I think that part of what we're trying to do is push in marginal changes, but we can take slightly bigger steps when that constitutional moment hits. And that's when we can maybe fundamentally do it, you know, switch the whole thing. And so, yeah. But do I believe, a very fascinating question you asked about democracy. Come to my talk on Friday, and I will try to address that question.
Thank you, and actually that was a very good thing to end the whole event with, which is an invitation to another talk by Professor Pete Boettke on Friday here, 3:30. And right after his talk, we have the second annual talk, part of the Prague Conference on Political Economy by Professor Terry Anderson, who also got mentioned. So we have a very unique week this week to have around professors who contributed to their sciences, who have very interesting thoughts. I believe strongly we have to use their presence as much as we can. So thank you everybody for coming today. Please come again on Friday afternoon because we can continue with the discussion. If you really like it, you still can sign up for the conference, meaning the Saturday's program, which is going to be here at CEVRO Institut, smaller groups, presentation of 30+ papers by leading scholars from 16 countries, covering topics such as economics, economic policy, political philosophy, law, and political science. So that's it for today. Please use Professor Boettke availability for one more thing. He can sign for you his book. Thank you for coming and have a nice evening.